Well, let's kick off, and hopefully some more of the folks who registered will hop in after we've begun. But welcome everyone. This is the UpCounty Democrats book talk, and we're also encouraging anyone who can and is interested to make a contribution to the Montgomery County Party if they are so inclined. But we appreciate you all for joining us tonight. My name is Andrew Sondry. I am the treasurer of the Montgomery County Democratic Central Committee, as well as the president of the Germantown Democratic Club. We are very privileged to be joined this evening by Michael Dobbs, who is a best-selling author of political histories in the United States. And if I remember correctly, reading your bio, you said you like to write about crisis moments during the 20th century. So I'm curious to pick your brain a little bit more about that tonight. But the UpCounty Democrats, for anyone who's not aware, are a coalition of Democratic clubs and caucuses across the northern part of Montgomery County. That is districts 14, 9, 17, 39, and 15. We're gearing up to do a lot of work for the general election, but for the moment, it's a lot of programming to try and engage folks to talk about the many things that are going on in the world today and how we got to this moment, which is why we thought this program would lean into that theme a little bit. I am now going to pass the mic over to Michael Dobbs so he can tell us a little bit about his research process for his most recent book, which was King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, An American Tragedy. And then we'll move into a more free-flow discussion. I have a number of questions, some of which are my own, having read this book now twice, and also some of which were submitted by a couple of our partners in the various clubs and caucuses. But without further ado, Mr. Dobbs, the floor is yours.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Good to join you. So just to introduce myself a little bit, I was a longtime correspondent for the Washington Post, mainly a foreign correspondent. I worked in mainly Eastern Europe, covered the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, Poland, and then later in the Soviet Union. And I guess I retired from the Washington Post about 20 years ago, and then I started writing books because, as they sometimes say, that the journalism is the first rough draft of history, and I was interested in the second draft, in a more complete draft, a more considered version of history. So, as you said, most of my books have been about what I call hinge moments in history, i.e., when everything changes, and particularly in the communist world, the collapse of communism, I wrote a book about the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the Cold War in 1945. I wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and my most recent book was about Nixon and Watergate. So what attracted me to the subject of Nixon and Watergate? As a reporter, I was very curious, and I wanted to know how politics really worked. And of course, the way politics is spun by politicians is not the same as it really works behind the scenes. Actually, there's a little like Robert Caro. Probably you've read his great books about LBJ, but Robert Caro was a political reporter for Newsday, I think, on Long Island. And he's talked about his motivation in becoming a historian and a biographer. And he wanted to understand how politics really worked, as opposed to the stories you read about politics in newspapers. And that led him to his really in-depth study on LBJ. And I think it's probably a similar motivation for me and Nixon that, I was, after 30, 40 years, a whole lot of sources become available that were not available at the time. And most obviously, in Nixon's cases, they are the famous tapes, which are an extraordinary historical resource. And I think they're a unique historical resource because no president is ever going to tape himself the way Nixon taped himself. Previous presidents had taped themselves, but not as extensively as Nixon. So you get this paradox with Nixon that he's a very private man, but we have the most detailed, public, agonizing record of his presidency, which is a gift to any writer, because, just imagine what it'd be like in the Trump presidency or the Biden presidency to be a fly on the wall in various rooms in the White House or in Camp David and listen to what's really happening behind the scenes. And that's the material that a writer has to work with in the case of Nixon. And I don't think justice had been done to this material. So, that was my motivation, was to describe a very dramatic moment in American history, not from the outside, but from the inside. And I was able to do that because of this extraordinary resource, the existence of these tape recordings. I mean, there are a lot of other sources for the book, but what really brings it alive is to be able to eavesdrop on these very intimate, sometimes agonized conversations that Nixon engaged in during this very dramatic period.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful primer on what drove you to cover the subject, because I think that was one of the big things that I heard from folks was why Nixon is a subject. And I know I've read those Caro books on Lyndon Johnson, and I'm sure a couple of the other people tuned in have as well, because those are such landmark studies on his character. But as you mentioned, some of these sources that we have on Johnson, on Nixon, no longer exist. There aren't going to be in 30 years' time recordings of President Biden, President Trump, President Obama. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what is the future of political historiography, and how are we going to be able to get that inside look on the human beings who really drive American history and world history without access to those kinds of resources?
Yeah. Well, it's going to be much more difficult because, this was really a gift. I think Bob Woodward called it the gift that keeps on giving, because the more you go into the Nixon record, the more you find there, and the more sort of amazing it becomes. And because of what happened to Nixon, Nixon, when he made these tapes, he thought they were private documents, and that historians wouldn't be able to get hold of them, that he would control them and use them for the purposes of his own autobiography. If he had known that historians were going to sort of go through all these tapes and find out many things that are embarrassing to him, he certainly wouldn't have tape recorded himself. And so no president is going to make that same mistake again. Now, for other presidents, we have a different sort of record. Actually, we do have tapes for some other presidents, not as extensive as for Nixon. LBJ taped many of his telephone conversations, and you can hear them often on C-SPAN. The difference between Nixon and other presidents was that Nixon did not have an on-off switch for his tape recording system. His chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, says that Nixon was actually he's very rather technologically clumsy, and Haldeman said that any system that relied on Nixon to turn it on or off would have been doomed to failure. So they convinced Nixon that it would be a good idea to have these tape recordings start automatically. And that's what makes them different to, say, the LBJ tape recordings. I mean, when LBJ wanted to tape himself, he turned it on and he controlled it. In Nixon's case, Nixon often forgets that it's on. He forgets which room the tape recorders are running. So it's much more of a sort of stream of consciousness and a sort of cinema verite record of what is happening in the White House than you get with other presidents. Now, as to how we, gather sources on presidents after Nixon, particularly Trump and Biden, for example. Well, some people say that, the equivalent of Nixon's tapes is Trump's tweets. I mean, I think it's completely different because, Trump decided when he was going to send out a tweet, and it's a sort of conscious political decision to, in his case, to tweet. Whereas, that was not the case in Nixon's that was not the case in Nixon's case. This is, in the case of Nixon, it's sort of an unfiltered stream of conversation, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and which is what makes it unique. Of course, in the previous centuries and decades, one valuable historical source is diaries. A lot of people, for example, around FDR, some of his aides kept diaries, which are extremely valuable. Some of Churchill's aides kept diaries. Some of the best details on Churchill's time as Prime Minister of Britain come from diarists. And that habit of keeping diary, I mean, it's still going on, but probably not as extensive as it was in the case of FDR or Churchill. So there's a lot of back and forth in email messages, in WhatsApp messages. I mean, some of that politicians are savvy enough to destroy. So a lot of that record is simply not going to be available. Some of it is available, and some of that will be used. So historians are always dealing with an incomplete historical record, and they'll do as best they can, but it's not going to be as complete or as revealing as it was in the case of Nixon.
Certainly. And one thing I think I worry about in using some of these diaries and things where you're not recording them on the spot is particularly with the rise of these alternative facts today, as they're sort of euphemistically called. I almost worry that the things that people choose to write down reflect not just their inner thoughts, but a very distorted view of the basic events that occurred around them. Is that something that you're worried about in terms of creating a narrative?
Yeah, of course. I mean, a diary is always written from the perspective of the diarist. So it's sort of a skewed version of events. By the way, Churchill had a lovely expression. He said that history was going to be very kind to him because he would write it himself. And actually, I think that was one of Nixon's motivations in keeping these tapes, because he thought he would use that in order to write his own version of history. And of course, he was wrong in that, because the tapes became available to everyone. But I'm right now writing a book actually about the 1983 period, which is 40 years ago, and I'm discovering it's very difficult because, I mean, not only because there are fewer, there's simply fewer resources available. Unfortunately, our National Archive record system is extremely dysfunctional. There are not enough resources being devoted to the keeping of records. So even events that are 40 years ago, there's not the material available to historians that there would have been in decades past. I mean, eventually, I guess we will have a complete record of the period that I'm now looking at, which is the early 1980s, the Reagan period. but it doesn't exist yet.
So I'm glad that you bring up the Reagan era as well, because one of the things that someone asked me to ask about was about why Watergate is such an evocative moment in American history, why it sticks in our imagination in a way that the Iran-Contra affair doesn't. In the way that the even the Clinton impeachment, which was very big at the time, but sort of left very little impact. Um, and some of the Trump scandals, which sort of seem to be, dime a dozen these days. Why is it that, Watergate sticks in our mind as this unique moment of corruption in the presidency, and ultimately then inspired such a massive bipartisan reaction that forced Nixon to resign?
Right. Well, it was the archetypal political scandal. I mean, now every scandal gets a gate after it. So Watergate was the original scandal, and now we get, I've forgotten what the Clinton, it was called Monica Gate, wasn't it, or something like that.
Yeah.
So every scandal becomes a gate nowadays. And probably some of the people listening in are old enough to remember the wall-to-wall television coverage of those days, and the way in which everybody tuned into their TVs in the evening to get the latest twist in this scandal. I mean, the cast of characters was extraordinary. So it had a lot of, it was very colorful, and the stakes were very high because it involved the president himself. But beyond that, I think that this goes to the reason why I called my book King Richard. I think that, and I called it King Richard because I wanted to evoke this sort of Shakespearean sense of tragedy. This is about the downfall of a president. The first time that a US president had been forced to resign. And whatever you think of Nixon, whether you admire him or you despise him, he was, I feel, a tragic figure in the sense that the qualities that brought him to the top were the same qualities that led to his downfall. And so you can see this sort of arc of Shakespearean tragedy in his life. And he was a man who started off from nothing. He wasn't like Trump, that he started off on third base. Nixon started off, in a dirt poor, born to a very poor family. Two of his brothers died of tuberculosis when he was in his teens. He had to sort of fight his way up right to the top. And then he loses, everything that he's fought for. And that is, to me, the essence of a tragic story. Now, why did I call it King Richard? Because actually his mother, who was a Quaker, a devout Quaker, she and she had high hopes for all her boys. She named 3 of them after former kings of England. So there are these Shakespearean tragedies, Richard II and Richard III, but actually Nixon was called after the first Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, who went off to the Holy Land and as a crusader. So he was a source of, he was a great hero in the eyes of Nixon's mother. But, now we confuse Nixon with Richard II, Richard III, much more sort of sinister rulers. So, I wanted to, I think that's one of the appeals of the Watergate story as a crucial moment, the stakes that were involved, not just all these smaller characters, but Nixon himself. When I was preparing to write the book, of course, a lot of people had written about Watergate and about Nixon, but I talked to a guy called Stanley Cutler, who was one of the first biographers of Nixon. He died about 10 years ago, but I talked to him before he died. And he wrote a book that was sort of full of every sort of the classic Watergate book, full of every twist and turn in the Watergate scandal, most of which we've now forgotten and are probably irrelevant. But he said to me, in 20 years' time or 30 years' time, we'll forget about all these other characters. The only character from Watergate that we will remember that will last will be Richard Nixon himself. And Nixon will be with us forever. And, I wanted to put Nixon back into the center of these incredible events and tell it from his perspective. And I was able to do that because of the, unique historical resource of the tapes that I've described earlier.
Yeah, so certainly to that end, you talk about him as a tragic figure. I'm wondering if in the process of writing this book, in the process of listening to all of these tapes, humanized him somewhat for you, because he does come off as in the high school history version of this is a somewhat two-dimensional character,
Yeah,
but you really flesh him out. I'm wondering if this humanized him for you.
right. Well, sure. I mean, I spent 2 years of my life sort of as an basically eavesdropping on Nixon's conversations and following him from room to room in the White House, and as though I, was almost a member of his family. So, whether I liked him or not, I did feel. I've said that people ask me, did you feel more sympathy for Nixon? And I said sympathy is the wrong word, but I did feel empathy in the sense that I understood what he was going through from his point of view, which I think is a important perspective for a biographer or a historian. And I tried not to be judgmental. I mean, you can read the book and you reach your own conclusions about whether you like Nixon or not. I mean, that's not my job as a writer to tell you what to think. My job is to put you in the room and then you reach these conclusions yourself. I mean, obviously, Nixon is an incredibly complicated person, which makes him interesting. I mean, he had, some extraordinary qualities and he had extraordinary defects. And any honest picture of Nixon has to describe both the defects and the good qualities, both the good and the bad.
Brilliant. So I've got one that I think sort of builds on that nicely and leads into this next to the following question, which I'll pull from the chat that was submitted. But first, one of the things that I always found interesting about the way that Watergate broke was that the details of it started to become public prior to the election, almost immediately after it had happened. And yet Nixon went on to win in a landslide in 1972,
Yeah,
because the story, I guess, really hadn't started to stick, or
yeah.
it didn't seem as big, or it didn't seem as directly connected to him. Why did people not think it was that big a deal? And then the subsequent question will be, ultimately, why did they come to the conclusion that it was
Yeah.
sort of a big deal?
Right. Well, this is exactly what sort of interested me because, as you say, he was elected by one of the biggest landslides in American history, by some measures, the biggest. Uh, and the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein had obviously been pursuing him, but by the time of the election, those stories had died down. Then he gets elected in November, and it's pretty quiet. And then in January of 1973, which is actually where my book begins, with a conversation on the eve of his inauguration, his second inaugural. He's at the top of his game, politically extremely powerful, riding high in the public opinion polls, plotting about how he's going to get even with all his enemies. And we have a conversation between him and Chuck Colson in the Lincoln sitting room in the White House. He's about to conclude a peace agreement in Vietnam, which is the great sort of he's been striving for years. He's had this, triumphant visit to China. So he's on the top of his game. And then within the space of 3 or 4 months, actually 100 days, which is the focus of my book, King Richard, it all falls apart. That this extremely disciplined White House, Haldeman was known as, Haldeman and Ehrlichman were the two Germans who had whipped the place into shape. They're one of the most disciplined White Houses in American of any American president. Suddenly, they all start turning on each other, and they all start, protecting themselves. Now, why did this happen? Because the whole plot, the whole conspiracy began to unwind in that 100 days, in that 3 months. And it happened because, well, there was a court case in Watergate. This is sort of, you could draw a parallel with, various court cases we're seeing with Trump now. But the people who had once been loyal to Nixon started turning on him in order to save their own skin. And at the beginning, it was somebody fairly low down, a man called James McCord, who came out and wrote a letter to the Judge Sirica, in this court case in the middle of January 1973, saying that perjury was committed in this trial. And, that set this ball rolling, because once McCord had taken the first step to turning on Nixon, then a lot of other people had to turn on Nixon. They had to think about protecting themselves as well. And, the key person was obviously John Dean. John Dean had been the hatchet man, the man who was in charge of the cover-up. And then at a certain point, he understood that unless he turned on Nixon, he would be the next victim. He's the sort of, actually, you could say that John Dean is the kind of Michael Cohen of Watergate. So these people who had been loyal to Nixon suddenly start turning on him, and then the whole thing begins to unravel. And by the end of this 100 days that I describe in this book, Nixon is forced to sacrifice his two closest aides, Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And by the end of it, he's thinking of committing suicide, or at least he's talking about committing suicide, of ending it all. So that's the period I wanted to describe. But why does it happen? Because it's this sort of, it's like a snowball coming down a mountain and creating an avalanche. One person turns, then the next person turns. And before from being able to control it, the cover-up completely unravels.
Yeah, I think that feeds nicely also into this next question, which was submitted by Michael DeLong, who's the president of the Young Dems. He asks, I understand that there are a lot of Republicans who are ready to vote to convict Nixon, and that's ultimately why he resigned. So there clearly was this transition to not only our staff turning on him, but congressional Republicans are turning on him. Very much in a way that congressional Republicans didn't turn on Trump either with the Ukraine investigation, or in large part with the January 6th impeachment. So Michael asks, why is that? Were senators less partisan and less ideologically driven back then? Did they just have more integrity? What was the reason?
Well, I think it's probably a mixture of reasons. There was more of a sort of sense of bipartisanship, and the Watergate investigation was a bipartisan investigation, which took a long, long period of time, by the way. It's not like these impeachments that you had under Trump, that they were launched and concluded within 2 or 3 weeks. The Watergate investigations took about 16, 17 months to conclude. But also there's the nature of the evidence. And probably Nixon would have been able to ride it out had it not been for the tapes. I mean, there was no, so at a certain point you have, okay, here's Dean's account of what happened, and then there's Nixon's account. So who do you believe? Well, you could believe Dean or Nixon, whichever you prefer, but there was no proof. But the proof was in the tapes. And so it took those tapes to convince majority of people in Congress, including a majority of Republicans, that Nixon had actually been in the cover-up was his doing, that he had, I mean, this is the so-called smoking gun tape that led to Nixon's resignation, has Nixon initiating the cover-up a few days after the Watergate break-in. That was on tape. So there was incontrovertible evidence, which, now the waters are so muddied. I mean, 12 jurors have found in New York that Trump, I'm getting Trump confused with Nixon now, but 12 jurors have found that Trump, caused these business records to be fabricated, and that was part of an effort to cover up a crime. But they made certain inferences there. The evidence was much clearer and much stronger in the case of Nixon and Watergate, because you had actual tapes, which you don't have in the case of Trump. I mean, it's rather like imagining that, this key conversation call between Cohen and Trump, in which, according to Cohen, Trump tells him to, pay off Sandy, whatever her name is, Stormy Daniels.
Stormy Daniels.
Yeah. And we've only got Trump's version of that, and we've only got Cohen's version of it, and Trump says it didn't happen. But in the case of Watergate, we know it happened because we have the tape of it. It's called the smoking gun tape.
I'm sure the New York DA wished they had the recording as well. But if I remember correctly, there was one witness who relayed a similar account of a conversation. But still, I'm sure that recording would have been highly welcomed in the courtroom.
We do have a tape recording that Cohen made relating to one of the other women that were paid off, Karen McDougal, I seem to remember her name.
Yeah.
Just about 30, 40 seconds, but we didn't have the tape recording for the crime he was actually accused of, which was paying off Stormy Daniels.
Yeah. So we had a couple of questions about sort of Nixon as a person. So I'll just sort of run through these really quick. One of them was about Nixon at the time was pretty highly regarded by the American public, and he was seen as a relatively effective figure on the world stage. But he was also, famously difficult to work with as an individual. He was paranoid. He was introverted. He was someone who was not like Lyndon Johnson, who was sort of overbearing and outgoing. How was he able to get so many elements of his agenda passed and deal with world leaders when he was, personally quite acerbic?
Right. Well, he was very disciplined. He set up a very effective White House structure through Haldeman, his chief of staff. Of course, this was also his Achilles heel, because he was a bit of he interfered in a lot of decisions. He was a micromanager, and some things he micromanaged too much, particularly Watergate itself. That got him into trouble. He should have kept it at arm's length. His main interest actually as in the case of John Kennedy, was not domestic politics, but it was foreign policy. And I mean, on that, he was a very subtle, strategic thinker. I mean, these are the years of Nixon and Kissinger, and having the opening to China, the détente with Russia, playing Russia off against China, and so on and so forth. And Kissinger gets a lot of the credit for that, but I think that actually Nixon, there's a lot of rivalry, by the way, between Kissinger and Nixon, and this is one reason why Nixon wanted to have the tape record because he didn't want Kissinger to get all the credit. He wanted to take the credit. But I think, to be fair to Nixon, a lot of the strategic thinking did not come from Kissinger. Kissinger implemented these foreign policy moves, but it was Nixon who decided on the opening to China, not Kissinger. So Nixon was a great reader. He, loved study of history, particularly, British history. Disraeli was one of his great heroes. And he's a very substantive, foreign policy thinker, actually. So I think that's another difference between him and Trump. I mean, whatever you think about Trump, he had not got the breadth of reading and the breadth of historical knowledge, to say the least, that Nixon had. I mean, Nixon and some of his judgments. I spent a lot of time in Russia, and some of the things that Nixon says about Russia are, quite prophetic, and he had a real understanding of Russia, which is amazing for an American president. Very subtle, sophisticated understanding of foreign affairs.
Thank you. One of the other ones was about Nixon sort of saw himself as something of an outsider. Even when he was in the White House, he conceived of himself as something of an anti-establishment figure, which I think today, reflects a lot in former President Trump, who conceives of himself as something outside of the establishment. But one of the clear parallels, I think, between that moment and this moment is, as you rise in the political ranks, you often mold the establishment around you. And by the time that you're president, you've got enough people sort of in various different positions of power who ascribe to either your philosophy or are loyal to you in one way or another, such that it's difficult to conceive of an American president actually being an anti-establishment figure. But he certainly seems to have seen himself that way. Do you think he actually was something, of an anti-establishment figure for his time? Or do you think he just had sort of a disconnect between the way he perceived of himself and the way that maybe the country perceived of him?
Of course, anybody who becomes president also becomes part of the establishment by definition. But, if you consider where Nixon came from and what it took for him to get up to the top, then yes, that sense of being an outsider and the resentments that came with being an outsider were one of the very powerful motivating forces for Nixon. And you see this constantly in the tapes. I mean, he's railing all the time against the Eastern Coast establishment. And, he didn't go to Harvard. Actually, one of the formative moments in Nixon's career as a politician was his pursuit of Alger Hiss, who turns out, by the way, to have spied for the Soviet Union, who was this sort of upper class waspish guy who'd been to Harvard. And Nixon felt that the State Department was protecting him. And there were these famous hearings. And at one point in the hearing, I've forgotten the dialogue exactly, but it's something that Nixon asks Hiss where he went to school, and Hiss says Harvard. And he says, And I understand you went to Whittier in a sort of very snobbish tone of voice. And, many people think that moment was, when Nixon sort of personally decided he was going to get his revenge against this East Coast snob who'd sort of tried to put him down for going to a lesser known school. So yeah, I think this outsider status, and then he plays on this. This is part of his political constituency. I mean, he invented the term the silent majority. That there was this silent majority of Americans out there, quite separate, quite distinct from the establishment that was running the country, that were with Nixon. And that was actually, he was correct in that in terms of in political terms. It was the silent majority that led to his incredible re-election victory. So he had a kind of political sense, but there were also these personal resentments that fueled it.
Excellent. I'm glad you brought up that silent majority component because I think this was another question that was brought to me by a friend of mine who was alive at the time and who said of Nixon that one of the biggest surprises when Nixon ran his first campaign, not his first campaign in 1960, but his first successful campaign in 68, was the way that he ran a much more dog whistle kind of campaign that talked a lot about this Southern strategy and doing some outreach to some of these folks who wanted a different version of America. Um, and my friend said this was a little bit jarring, knowing sort of where he'd come from, because Nixon had in the 1950s been sort of the champion of a much stronger civil rights legislation when he was Eisenhower's vice president. Um, was that, do you think, and granted, this is a little bit before the time of King Richard, but just as a Nixon scholar, do you think that was his evolution or de-evolution really on the issue of civil rights? Do you think that was reflective of political calculus on his part, or does it reflect on some sincerely held, racist beliefs?
Yeah. No, I think it was mainly political calculus. I didn't think Nixon was a racist, well, in the sense that, I mean, he was, if you listen to the tapes, there are a lot of anti-Semitic slurs on it. I mean, he's sort of railing against the Jews all the time, and to some extent against the blacks as well. Yeah. So there's so that is there, and whether it's worse than, was typical for the times, I'm not sure. I don't know, but I think so. You certainly find remarks that cause our eyebrows to rise from present day perspective. And probably a lot of that was sort of fairly routine for the times. I mean, even, Eleanor Roosevelt made anti-Semitic remarks. So I think in Nixon's case, it was mainly a political calculation because, this was the point at which the Republicans started, the politics of the South were changing because of civil rights, and the Republicans were taking over constituencies that had previously, voted Democrat.
Yeah, certainly that seems one way of one lens of looking at his change in action over time on the issue. Um, Jumping back to Watergate for a minute, because that is really the subject of your work. Um, do you think that one, we're still living with the damage to the American psyche that Watergate caused? And two, what can we learn from that as we move into an era where these kinds of scandals are becoming more and more common?
Mhm. Well, Watergate did, I mean, it was the end of this sort of era of automatically respecting the presidency and automatically respecting the institutions. I mean, in one sense, the system actually worked in 1972, or 73, 72, 73. There was an investigation. The president was forced to resign, and in the end, Nixon accepted that. Um, I mean, Nixon was, for all his railing against the system, in the end, he resigned without much of a fuss. He didn't try to, um, stay in office. He didn't try to steal an election, or he didn't try to contest the results of an election. And this goes back to Kennedy's election. Actually, the 1960 election was a lot closer than the last election. And particularly in Illinois, Chicago, and Texas, Nixon had some basis for contesting the election, but he didn't contest it because, you didn't contest elections in those days. So although he was an outsider, he also sort of played, in the end, he played by the rules of the game. And that brought him down. I mean, he probably resented that. He deeply resented it, in fact. And then he thought, well, I will get my own back by writing, my biography. So this is why, in the end, I call this, and I'm veering off your question here, but I call this an American tragedy, it's not a Shakespearean tragedy, because the hero, you could never quite push Nixon down. There was always a new Nixon. The old Nixon was destroyed, often because of his own mistakes, and he brought himself down. But then he would reinvent himself as something else. They kept on talking about new Nixons. So even, he was forced to resign the presidency, but then he reinvents himself as an older statesman and ends up, fairly respected in the sense that he's respected as a foreign policy thinker. And when at his funeral, I think his funeral is attended by, 5 living presidents. He's buried with great honors. So in the end, he was part of the establishment. And now, I mean, of course, that period, this is also the period of Roe versus Wade. Actually, this is exactly the same period of Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade, which didn't cause much of a ripple at the time, but it sort of started this rift or it was part of the rift in American politics that developed from the early 70s on. And you can see it on the Republican side that a sort of, resentment started growing at the way their president had been treated and the way this case had been decided in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so when we look then at the various scandals that we see today, from the former President Trump trying to blackmail the president of Ukraine, or extort the president of Ukraine to get blackmail on then former Vice President Joe Biden, January 6th, some of these other um, run-of-the-mill scandals, because there's been sort of a lot of these over the course of the years, and not just within those 4 years, but there have been a lot of scandals sort of over the last 20, 30 years as well. Do you think that there are things that we can take away from the way that we as a nation responded to Watergate, that leaders responded to Watergate, that are going to help us respond to the crises that we see today?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I said, the system did work in the case of Watergate, that there was a very thorough investigation. They made it a bipartisan investigation, and that was why it was successful in the end. Of course, they had better evidence. But they also, I mean, if you compare the impeachment investigation of Nixon with the impeachment investigations of Trump, you have to say that the impeachment investigation, I used to have in my bookcase behind me, all the volumes of the Senate Judiciary and the Senate Watergate Committee investigations of Watergate. And they're sort of, 20 volumes of them, thick, great volumes. The amount of documentation that they collected on Nixon's impeachment, makes the Trump impeachments look amateur. So I think if I was to be critical of the Trump impeachments, I'd say that not enough. I mean, I've forgotten how many of them there were. Were there 3 or 2?
Two.
Just 2. Okay.
But we had the Mueller report as well.
Even the 2 together, did not amount to the amount of evidence that was accumulated in the case of Nixon, and the seriousness which they went about it, and the bipartisan nature of the investigation, way exceeded anything that was done in the case of the Trump investigation.
So one of the concerns, I think, with the way that the Trump impeachments played out was that Republicans simply weren't willing to participate in a lot of ways with those investigations, the way that they were in the Nixon impeachment investigation. You think that undermined the ability of those committees to conduct an investigation that would be taken seriously by as many people?
Well, I think obviously, in order to be successful, there had to be a sort of bipartisan basis to them. Otherwise, you couldn't get the votes in the Senate to convict. So that had to be the starting point. Now, whether it was feasible or not feasible, I haven't sort of really thought very much about. But and probably it wasn't feasible given the very divided nature of American politics. Perhaps it was just a different era. It wasn't feasible, but I don't think they made the effort that they made in, that one can see in the case of the Watergate investigation. Also, the Watergate investigation, you had trials that were going on at the same period. So, all these investigations fed into each other and supplied evidence. So, yeah, I mean, to me, the Trump impeachment, the Clinton impeachments were much more political in the way they were handled than the Nixon impeachment, which ultimately led to his resignation.
Excellent. Well, we are running close to the end of our time here. We've got until 8. But I do just want to say, one, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with in terms of what we can do as students of history to make sure that history is preserved, and also that we're able to learn from the lessons of the past moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say, it's often forgotten about the resources that are devoted to the research and writing of history. I mean, it's kind of afterthought. I mean, partly this has come up with, another of Trump's trials, the fact that he just went off with a lot of documents from his White House and stuck them in Mar-a-Lago. But as a result of, the rules changed with Nixon. And a lot of the records that previously were thought of as private, as a result of Watergate, then came to be considered the property of the National Archives. So the law that Trump is being charged under for taking those documents with him to Mar-a-Lago and not surrendering them to the National Archives are laws that were put into effect as a result of Watergate and as a result of the argument over the the evidence of Watergate. But the larger question here is how much resources we put into saving the archival record. And I have to say that under under Republican presidents, under Democrat presidents, it's getting more. The National Archives, which used to be one of the great sort of treasures of America, has been run down. The amount of time it now takes to for documents to be declassified, for perfectly ordinary documents to end up in the National Archives and make them available for research, for State Department documents, military records to become accessible to the public. I mean, it has become a scandal over the last 10, 20 years because less and less money, and in the end, it's a question of financial resources, that less and less, we're devoting less and less resources to the preservation and writing of history. So, of course, it's not a very sort of sexy topic, but I think, historians are, like myself are kind of thumping the tub about this all the time. But, voters have to be, and, people active in political life have to put more effort into it as well, because the writing of history tends to be forgotten. You just take it for granted, but it demands resources and financial resources. And we have this National Archives is here in Maryland, in College Park. Unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer specialists at the National Archives who can help researchers. And then the whole FOIA system, the Freedom of Information system, is broken down, and documents that you used to be able to FOIA a document and get a result in a few weeks or months. I mean, now it takes years and years. So I approached the Reagan Library and asked them for certain documents from the 1980 period. And they said, well, you have to ask for that, and there's a 7 to 8 year wait, and then we'll sort of see if they can be declassified or not. Those same documents, from the Kennedy Library would have been declassified decades ago. From the Second World War, they would have been, declassified and released within a period of 30 to 40 years. Now we're waiting for decades for documents. We could wait for 70, 80 years for documents from the Reagan era, and even longer for subsequent presidents. So that has become a national scandal, and something should be done about it. But, it's not as big as some of the other scandals out there. So unfortunately, very little gets done. Anyway, that's just a complaint from a working historian.
No, certainly, and I think we'd all like to have the opportunity to learn about some of these things, that happened 40, 50 years ago in our lifetimes, rather than having to wait, until we're all dead and gone to learn about people who have been dead and gone for decades. But we are out of time now. So I did want to just thank you so much for joining us tonight, Michael, and thank you to all of our attendees who tuned in. For anyone who's interested in learning more about some of his works, you can go to michaeldobbsbooks.com, and you can, I believe, can you purchase them through your website as well?
I think there's a link to Amazon or somewhere else, but you can read more about them, certainly at my website.
Excellent. Well, certainly start off on his website and consider purchasing some of his books. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And thank you so much, Michael. And we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.